My name is Joseph Taylor. For 42 years, I was a structural engineer, a man who found a quiet sort of poetry in blueprints and the steadfast integrity of steel and concrete. I believe in foundations, in things built to last. It's a belief that shaped my career, my marriage to my late wife, Helen, and the way I raised our only son, Michael. Now, at 70, I am retired. My world has shrunk to the size of the modest brick house I helped design in a quiet, tree-lined suburb of Havenwood, a city that has grown up around me. My days are measured by the rising sun, the crossword puzzle in the morning paper, and the scent of the rose bushes Helen planted in the backyard. It is a simple life, but it is a life built on a foundation I thought was solid. The first crack in that foundation appeared on a cold December afternoon, a week before Christmas. I was in the living room, a fire whispering in the hearth, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift past the window. I'd spent the morning fixing Mrs. Gable's porch railing down the street, a small act of neighborliness that left my hands stiff but my heart warm. That's when Michael arrived. He didn't use his key. The doorbell chimed, sharp and impatient, a sound that felt foreign in the gentle quiet of my home. When I opened the door, he stood on the porch, a figure of sharp angles and expensive fabrics. His cashmere coat was the color of a winter sky, his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of a world far removed from mine, the world of his father-in-law, Daniel Sterling. "Dad, why can't you be more like Daniel?" The words weren't shouted. They were delivered with a kind of weary disappointment, as if my very existence was a burden he could no longer bear. He stepped past me into the house, his gaze sweeping over the room with a dismissive air. He flicked a piece of lint from his sleeve, a gesture more eloquent than any insult. He's a real man. He builds empires, not bookshelves. The sledgehammer he'd swung at my chest was metaphorical, but the impact felt brutally real. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. I looked at my son, the boy I'd taught to read a compass, the teenager I'd sat with for hours while he struggled with calculus, and saw a stranger. "What did you just say to me, Michael?" My voice was a low rumble, the sound of deep earth shifting before a quake. He sighed, a dramatic exhalation of impatience. "You heard me. Look at this place." He gestured vaguely at the worn armchair where Helen used to knit, at the framed photos on the mantelpiece, at a life's worth of memories. "It's quaint. Laura's friends ask what my father does. What am I supposed to say? He's a retired engineer who lives in a time capsule." The blood rushed to my head, hot and dizzying. I looked down at my own hands, at the calluses that had never quite faded, at the network of fine lines that mapped out a lifetime of honest work. "These hands," I said, my voice shaking with a sudden, unfamiliar rage, "paid for the education that got you the job where you met Laura Sterling. Every single beam I inspected, every foundation I approved, it was for you." "A job that was a dead end until Daniel took me under his wing," he countered, straightening the silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. "Daniel gave me access to real capital, real influence. You gave me a work ethic that's useless in the world that matters." Something inside me, a retaining wall I had carefully maintained for 37 years of fatherhood, finally crumbled. The quiet disappointment I'd felt over the years as he'd grown more distant, more enamored with the Sterling fortune, coalesced into a single, sharp point of pain. "Out," I said. The word was quiet, but it had the weight of concrete. I pointed a trembling finger toward the front door. Michael laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. "Oh, don't play the wounded patriarch, Dad. We both know I've outgrown this place. I've outgrown you." He walked to the door, his steps measured and confident. "Maybe it's time you accepted that. Some people are meant for bigger things." The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound silence. The snowflakes continued their gentle descent outside, oblivious to the storm that had just broken within my walls. I stood there for a long time, the ghosts of his words swirling around me, quaint. Time capsule. Useless. Mechanically, I walked to the window and watched his sleek, dark sedan pull away from the curb, its tires leaving clean, black tracks in the fresh snow. As the car disappeared, I heard a sound from the end of my driveway, a harsh, metallic scrape, then a thud. Exhausted, emotionally hollowed out, I didn't have the strength to investigate. I assumed it was a snowplow hitting a loose piece of asphalt. That evening, I moved through my routine like an automaton. I hung up my flannel shirt, its familiar scent of sawdust and cold air a strange comfort. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection seemed older, the lines around my eyes deeper, etched not by age, but by a grief so sharp it felt like a physical wound. A real man builds empires. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, memories flooded the darkness. Michael, age 8, his face alight with wonder as we watched a skyscraper's frame being hoisted into place. "You did that, Dad? You made sure it won't fall down." The pride in his voice was the fuel that had powered me through countless overtime hours. The night I drove straight from a 36-hour inspection shift at the Henderson Bridge project to his high school graduation, my suit rumpled, my eyes bloodshot, but I was there. He had hugged me tightly, his face buried in my shoulder. "Thanks for always showing up, Dad," he'd whispered. When had that pride curdled into shame? It started subtly after he met Laura. After his first visit to the Sterling estate, a sprawling compound in the hills overlooking Havenwood. He'd come home dazed, his eyes lit with a covetous fire I'd never seen before. "Dad, you wouldn't believe Daniel's library. 2 stories. First editions. He has a map from the 1600s on the wall. His awe was laced with something else, a new and bitter vintage of envy." Then came the comparisons. Daniel says a diversified portfolio is the only real security. The invitations to dinner grew less frequent. "Sorry, Dad, Laura's family has a charity gala." My world, built on the principles of stability and tangible value, seemed to shrink and fade in the glittering light of the Sterling dynasty. Today's confrontation wasn't a sudden squall, it was the hurricane that had been gathering strength for years. Daniel Sterling hadn't just gained a son-in-law, he had, without any malicious intent I could discern, siphoned the soul of my son. He had offered a world where my life's work seemed small, my sacrifices insignificant. The old house creaked around me, the familiar groans of settling would a lonely comfort. This house, the one Michael now saw as a symbol of my failure, had been his sanctuary through every fever, every heartbreak, every triumph of his youth. As sleep finally claimed me, his last words echoed in the chambers of my heart. "Some people are meant for bigger things." And I, it seemed, was not one of them. The morning light was pale and thin, filtered through a sky the color of lead. My joints ached as I swung my legs out of bed, each movement a stiff reminder of the 70 years I had carried. The emotional bludgeoning of the previous day had settled into a deep, physical weariness. I moved toward the kitchen, my slippers whispering on the hardwood floors, the need for coffee a primal urge. The world outside was blanketed in a perfect, undisturbed layer of snow. The quiet of the morning was usually a comfort, a blank page on which to write the day. But as I opened the front door to retrieve the newspaper, a jolt of wrongness shot through me. My mailbox, a sturdy, custom-built steel box I had fabricated and installed myself 20 years ago, was mangled. It was bent sideways on its post, the door wrenched from its hinges and hanging askew. I walked down the snowy path, my breath pluming in the frigid air. This was no random act of teenage vandalism. The damage was precise, deliberate. Someone had used a heavy tool, a crowbar perhaps, to systematically destroy it. The metallic scraping sound from last night clicked into place. I bent down, my knees protesting, and saw them. A single set of large boot prints in the snow, leading from the street to the mailbox and back to where Michael's car had been parked. A cold dread, entirely different from yesterday's grief, crept up my spine. This was personal. This was a message. Back in the warmth of my kitchen, the coffee brewing, I tried to dismiss it as a paranoid leap of logic. But the timing, the cold precision of the act, it felt like an exclamation point on Michael's parting words. I sat at my kitchen table, the newspaper open but unread. The words blurred as my mind raced, trying to connect the venomous confrontation, the vandalized mailbox, the growing sense that this wasn't over. It felt like the opening act of a play I didn't understand, a cruel drama in which I had been unwillingly cast. The phone rang at precisely 9 o'clock, its shrill cry tearing through the heavy silence. I let it ring 3 times before picking it up, my heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Dad? It's me." Michael's voice was slick with an artificial warmth that set my teeth on edge. It was the voice of a salesman, not a son. "Michael." I kept my own voice flat, a calm surface on a turbulent sea. "Listen, about yesterday. I was completely out of line." The words were smooth, too smooth, rehearsed. "I've been up all night thinking about it. I said things I didn't mean. I'm so sorry." My grip on the receiver tightened. I knew this performance. It was the same one he used as a teenager when he wanted to borrow the car after being grounded. "You seemed quite certain of your feelings," I said, my tone cool. "No, that's just it. I was stressed. Work, money. You know how intense Laura's family can be." He gave a small, hollow laugh. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The Michael of yesterday had been cruel, but he had been honest. This Michael, the contrite, apologetic one, felt far more dangerous. "Actually," he continued, his voice brightening, "that's why I'm calling. Laura and we want you to come for Christmas dinner tomorrow night. It'll be a proper family celebration. Daniel will be there, and some of his business partners. We want you there. We need you there. Christmas dinner." The invitation was so unexpected, so at odds with yesterday's vitriol, that it left me speechless. A foolish, desperate part of me, the part that was still a father above all else, wanted to believe him. It wanted to believe this was a genuine olive branch. I suppose I could," I heard myself say, the words tasting of hope and doubt. "Fantastic. Oh, and Dad? Could you wear that nice navy suit? The one you wore for Mom's service?" First impressions are so important to Daniel's circle. The line went quiet for a moment. I thought he was about to hang up, but then I heard muffled voices in the background. He must have put the phone down without disconnecting. "He bought it," Michael's voice said, low and triumphant. His laugh was sharp, a sound like tearing metal. Did you hear that pathetic hope in his voice? Then came Laura's reply, her tone dripping with amusement. "You're a terrible son, Michael. But I have to admit, this will be exquisite. Daniel will love the juxtaposition. The self-made titan of industry and the humble, working-class father. The optics are perfect." "It's not just optics," Michael said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's about the legacy trust. Daniel needs to see me as my own man, someone who has risen above his origins. Having Dad there, looking so out of his element, it solidifies my narrative. It makes me look stronger by comparison. By the end of the night, Daniel will see that I'm the one who deserves to carry on his legacy, not some distant cousin. And he'll be so touched that we forgave your father and included him," Laura added, her voice a silken thread of cunning. "It shows our compassionate nature. It's perfect." My hand was shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a stage direction. They were not inviting a father. They were casting a prop. My grief from yesterday was nothing compared to the cold, clear shock of this betrayal. They were planning to use my love, my forgiveness, my very presence, as a tool for public humiliation to secure an inheritance. I gently, silently, placed the receiver back in its cradle. The kitchen walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the poison of their words. For a full minute, I could not move, could not breathe. I was just an old man in a quiet house, staring at a telephone. But then, slowly, something else began to rise from the wreckage of my heart. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even rage. It was the calm, quiet, unyielding strength of a foundation that has been tested and refused to break. My father, a man who built barns with his bare hands, once told me, "Joseph, your worth isn't in what you build. It's in what you do when someone tries to tear it down." Michael and Laura had made a critical miscalculation. They saw a quiet, retired engineer. They saw a lonely old man they could manipulate. They had forgotten that an engineer's greatest skill is understanding stress points, leverage, and the precise application of force. They wanted to play a game. And I realized, with a clarity that was as cold and sharp as the winter air outside, that I was about to show them how it was played. The first call I made was not to a friend or a lawyer. It was to a man I had met only a handful of times, a man whose world was as different from mine as granite is from gold leaf. I retrieved the business card from the back of my desk drawer, where it had sat for over a year. The cardstock was thick, creamy, the lettering a crisp, embossed navy blue. Sterling Holdings. Daniel Sterling, Chairman. Beneath his name was his private mobile number. He had given it to me at Michael's birthday party last year, with a firm handshake and a direct, assessing gaze. "Joseph," he'd said, "we're family now. Call me if you ever need anything." At the time, I'd considered it a polite, empty gesture. Now, it felt like a lifeline. My mind, trained for decades to analyze problems, assess variables, and formulate plans, began to work with a cool efficiency. Their plan was to use me as a foil, to highlight my modest circumstances against Daniel's immense success. They believed this would impress him, prove Michael had risen above his roots. It was a strategy built on a deeply flawed assumption that Daniel Sterling, a man who had clawed his way to the top from a background not much different from my own, would admire such a shallow and cruel display. I remembered a story Daniel had told at that same party about firing a top executive who had been caught falsifying expense reports for a mere few $100s. "It's not about the money," Daniel had explained to the small group gathered around him. "It's about the character. A man who will lie about the small things will lie about the big things. Integrity is the only currency that matters in the long run." That was my leverage. Integrity. I rehearsed the conversation in my head. I couldn't sound like a wounded father seeking revenge. I had to be an engineer presenting a structural flaw. Factual. Calm. Objective. I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. "Sterling." His voice was brisk, no nonsense. "Daniel, this is Joseph Taylor, Michael's father." There was a brief pause. "Joseph, it's good to hear from you. Is everything all right?" "I'm afraid not," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I know this is an unorthodox call, but I've become aware of a situation that involves you, and I believe you have a right to know the full truth before tomorrow night's dinner." I laid it out for him, piece by piece, without emotion. I recounted my son's words, the vandalized mailbox, the phone call, and the conversation I had accidentally overheard. I repeated their words, juxtaposition, optics, solidify my narrative like a witness testifying in court. I made no requests. I issued no demands. I simply presented the facts. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. For a moment, I feared he didn't believe me, that he would side with his daughter. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, coiled like a spring. "Joseph, are you certain of what you heard?" "As certain as I am of my own name, Daniel." Another long pause. Then a heavy sigh. "The damn fools," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Then his voice sharpened, the executive taking command. "Joseph, I am in your debt. They have grossly misjudged me. And they have grossly underestimated you." His tone shifted again, becoming conspiratorial, a general outlining a countermaneuver. "They want a performance tomorrow night? Fine. We'll give them one. But we'll be following a different script." My script. For the next 10 minutes, we spoke not as in-laws, but as allies. We laid a plan, simple in its execution, but devastating in its potential impact. When I hung up the phone, the house no longer felt like a prison of my grief. It felt like a command center. The rest of the day was a blur of quiet, focused activity. I drove to the specialty market across town and bought a 20-pound free-range turkey, fresh cranberries, wild rice, and everything else needed for a proper Christmas feast. I spent the afternoon in my kitchen, the room filling with the warm, honest smells of roasting garlic, simmering stock, and baking bread. I was not just cooking a meal, I was building an alternative. I was creating a sanctuary of genuine hospitality to contrast with their theater of false sentiment. I set my dining room table with Helen's best china, the plates she had treasured, and polished the silver until it gleamed. I set 8 places. As I worked, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I was no longer a victim of their scheme. I was an architect of its undoing. The next evening, I drove my 10-year-old sedan through the winding roads of Sterling Hills. Mansions glittered on either side, their elaborate Christmas displays competing in a silent, ostentatious battle of wealth. Michael and Laura's house was a monolith of glass and pale stone, lit up like a Hollywood premiere. A valet, a young man in a crisp uniform, looked at my car with thinly veiled disdain before directing me to a spot on the street, far from the Bentleys and Porsches that crowded the driveway. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My navy suit was old but immaculate, my silver hair was neatly combed, my tie was straight. I was not the prop they had imagined. I was a man walking into a situation of his own design. As I walked up the heated stone pathway, the front door swung open before I could ring the bell. Michael stood framed in the doorway, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well," he announced, his voice loud enough for the guests inside to hear. "Look what the cat dragged in." Laura appeared at his side, a vision in emerald green silk. Her smile was sharp and predatory. "Oh, this is precious," she cooed. He actually came. Michael took a step forward, physically blocking my entry. He was performing for the audience I could see mingling behind him, glasses of champagne in hand. "Dad," he said, his voice laced with mock pity, "let me make this perfectly clear. You are not part of this family. We are Sterlings. You are not. Now, turn around and go back to your little workshop of a house." The words were meant to be daggers, to wound me and display his dominance. Inside, I could see faces turning, conversations faltering. This was the moment they had orchestrated. Laura's faint, cruel laugh confirmed it. But instead of the shame and anger they expected, I felt only a profound, crystalline calm. I looked past my son, past his beautiful, venomous wife, and let my gaze rest on the crowd inside. I did not see Daniel Sterling among them. The plan was in motion. I met Michael's gaze, my expression unreadable. "I understand," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the cold night air. "I hope you both get everything you deserve tonight." The placidity of my response clearly unnerved him. His script called for me to argue, to plead, to be humiliated. My quiet dignity was an improvisation he hadn't anticipated. "That's right, old man," he stammered, his bravado faltering slightly. "Go on. Get out." I turned without another word and walked back toward my car. My steps were measured, my back straight. I could feel their eyes on me, their victory suddenly feeling hollow, incomplete. I settled into the driver's seat of my car and took out my phone. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the grand, brightly lit house. I dialed the number. It rang once. "Is it done?" Daniel's voice was grim. "It is," I replied. "As we discussed." "Understood. Thank you, Joseph." The line went dead. I watched the house. For a minute, nothing happened. Then, through the large picture window, I saw a figure I recognized as Daniel Sterling's most senior partner step into the center of the room and raise his glass. The murmur of conversation died down. Then, one by one, the guests began to put down their drinks. A woman retrieved her wrap. A man signaled to his wife. A quiet, orderly, and unmistakable exodus began. It was not a panicked rush, but a coordinated withdrawal, executed with the precision of a corporate takeover. The front door opened again. This time, it was not Michael, but a stream of Havenwood's most influential citizens, their faces polite but impassive masks. They walked past Michael and Laura, who stood frozen in the doorway, their triumphant expressions collapsing into sheer, uncomprehending horror. "Where are you going?" Michael's voice was a desperate crack. "The party's just starting." Daniel was called away on an urgent matter, one of the men said coolly, not breaking stride. "We felt it best to depart." But he's not even here," Laura cried. A woman in a fur coat gave her a look of pity. "Exactly," she said, and continued down the path. In less than 5 minutes, the driveway was emptying. The valet was scrambling, trying to keep up with the sudden demand. Michael and Laura were left standing in the doorway of their magnificent, now empty house, the echoes of a party that never was ringing in their ears. Just as the last guest car pulled away, a black town car I didn't recognize glided to a stop beside my Honda. The back window lowered, and Daniel Sterling looked out at me. He hadn't been at the party at all. He had been orchestrating everything from afar. "I believe," he said, a faint, grim smile on his lips, "that we have a dinner to attend. Shall we?" Another car pulled up behind his. And another. A small convoy of Havenwood's elite, the inner circle of Daniel's most trusted friends and partners, men and women who valued loyalty above all else. "Follow me, gentlemen," I said, starting my engine. "It's not far." And so, my humble sedan led a procession of luxury vehicles away from the cold splendor of Sterling Hills and toward the warm, quiet streets of my neighborhood. In my rearview mirror, I could see the silhouette of my son and his wife, two small, lonely figures stranded in the cold, bright light of their empty mansion. Justice, I reflected, is a dish best served with quiet dignity. And a side of roasted turkey. The arrival of 3 gleaming luxury cars on my quiet, middle-class street caused a few curtains to twitch. Mrs. Gable peered out her window, her expression a mixture of confusion and intrigue. I felt a small, wry smile touch my lips. I opened my front door and the warm, fragrant air of my home spilled out into the cold night, the rich scent of roasted turkey, sage, and apple pie. It was the smell of a real Christmas. "My God, Joseph," Daniel said, stepping inside and looking around my living room. The fire was crackling, Helen's handmade stockings were hung on the mantel, and the table was set, waiting. "You really did all this?" "A good engineer always has a contingency plan," I replied, taking his coat. His guests, 3 other couples, followed him in. They were not the glitzy, social climbing crowd I'd seen at the mansion. These were Daniel's core people, his oldest partner, his sharpest legal counsel, his most trusted board member, and their spouses. They moved through my home not with condescension, but with a quiet, respectful curiosity. They looked at the family photos, the worn books, the comfortable, lived-in furniture. "This feels right," said the lawyer, a woman with intelligent eyes, as she settled into the armchair. "This feels like Christmas." What followed was one of the most remarkable evenings of my life. Daniel Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets, insisted on helping me carve the turkey. His partner, a man who managed a billion-dollar portfolio, laughed as he recounted stories of his own father, a plumber from the east side of town. We sat around my dining room table, 8 people from vastly different worlds, and we broke bread together. We talked about work, not about stock prices, but about the satisfaction of a job well done. We talked about family, not about legacies and inheritances, but about first steps and scraped knees. They praised my cooking with a genuine enthusiasm that was more satisfying than any financial reward. In the warm glow of the candlelight, we were not titans of industry and a retired engineer. We were just people, sharing a meal and a moment of authentic connection. As I was clearing the plates for dessert, headlights swept across the front window. A car door slammed. The front door burst open without a knock. Michael and Laura stood there, their faces pale with fury and desperation. They took in the scene, the convivial gathering, the remnants of a feast, Daniel Sterling sitting at the head of my table like a patriarch in his rightful place. "How could you?" Michael's voice was raw with a sense of cosmic injustice. "You stole our party. You stole our guests." The table fell silent. Daniel placed his napkin deliberately on the table. "No one was stolen, Michael," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "They simply chose to be in a place where family isn't used as a stepping stone. He manipulated you." Laura shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He played the victim, the poor old man, to turn you against us." Daniel rose slowly from his chair. The friendly dinner guest was gone, replaced by the chairman of the board. "I have been a fool, Laura. But not in the way you think. I was a fool to believe that you and Michael shared any of my core values. I built my company, my life, on loyalty, hard work, and integrity. Tonight, you showed me you possess none of those things." He looked from his daughter to my son, his gaze as cold and hard as a diamond. "Effective immediately, Michael, your position at Sterling Holdings is terminated. Your access to all company accounts and properties is revoked. As for you, Laura," he continued, his voice heavy with a father's deepest disappointment, I will be meeting with my lawyers next week to restructure my will. The bulk of my estate will be placed in a charitable foundation. You will receive a trust sufficient for a comfortable life, but the sterling legacy you were so eager to secure is no longer yours to inherit. You can't do this. Michael sputtered, his face ashen. This is all his fault. He whirled on me, his eyes wild with hatred. You've ruined my life. I looked at my son, the boy I loved, the stranger he had become, and I felt a great, yawning sadness. No, Michael, I said quietly. You built this life. All I did was hold up a mirror so everyone could see the plans. They stood there for a moment longer, trapped in the wreckage of their own making. Then, without another word, Laura grabbed Michael's arm and pulled him out the door, slamming it shut behind them. The silence they left behind was not awkward, but peaceful. Daniel sat back down, the weight of the evening settling on his shoulders. He looked at me across the table. Joseph, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I am so sorry. You have nothing to apologize for, Daniel, I said. Sometimes a structure is built on a faulty foundation. The only thing to do is tear it down and start again. One of the other guests raised his wine glass. To new foundations, he said. We all raised our glasses. To family, Daniel added, his eyes meeting mine. The one you find along the way. I looked around the table at these new, unexpected friends. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow fell softly on the quiet street. My house was filled with warmth and light. I had lost a son, perhaps for good, but in defending my own dignity, in standing firm on the foundation of my own life, I had found something else. I had found myself. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely at home.